Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to Dr. Jeffery Horace's reading of his novella, The Bottomless Bottle of Beer, which was written by Dr. Hodges, but illustrated by Terrance Lindall. We're going to, after Dr. Hodges' reading, we're going to take some questions. So, in case you do have questions, please keep them on hold until after the reading finishes. Okay, this is just a brief introduction of Dr. Hodges. He's currently the professor of our EPO, English Program Office Department of IHA, and he's also the adjunct professor in the Scranton College of IHA as well. His education, he has a BA in English Literature from Baylor University and an MA in History of Science from Berkeley, as well as a PhD in History in same Berkeley. He's won many awards, one being the Rosalind Schneider Eisner Prize in Poetry, which was in 1985. He has a Fulbright Doctoral Scholarship, as well as a Golden Mirror Fellowship. He has many publications, over 30 scholarly publications, and some of these include poetry and fiction. And he's also doing translation work of Korean pieces as well. And is this your first novella?
Yes.
So we'll now proceed to Dr. Hodges' reading of The Bottomless Bottle of Beer.
Thank you, Kathy. Actually, my wife does the translating of the Korean literature, and I do the editing and reformulating. So my Korean is not that good. Let me see. Here. Is this working? Everybody hear me? I'll have to take a drink of water occasionally, and my mouth gets quite dry doing this. You know, from teaching, it happens. Well, as you see, my story is titled The Bottomless Bottle of Beer, and it's illustrated by Terrance Lindall, as Kathy noted. Perhaps some of you have heard of Lindall, for he's a somewhat renowned American artist and illustrator whose work appeals to both popular and high culture. Thus, his art has appeared on the covers of such magazines as Creepy and Heavy Metal, but also on the covers of scholarly books. For instance, 2 different illustrations by Lindall of scenes from John Milton's Paradise Lost appear on the covers of The Complete Poetry and Essential Prose of John Milton and The Cambridge Companion to Paradise Lost, the latter book being a publication of Cambridge University Press. Additionally, Lindall is co-director and chief administrator of the Williamsburg Art and Historical Center in Brooklyn, New York. So we go to the second slide, okay. You see here Lindall's illustration for the cover of my story. I should first state that I gave Lindall complete artistic freedom with the illustrations, so the images don't always strictly correspond to the words. Let's take a brief look at these images on this cover. The book lying flat on the shelf has the title Areopagitica written along its spine. That's the title of a long essay by John Milton defending free thought, free expression, and free publication. In short, a defense against censorship. And this essay is considered one of the great works in the struggle for free speech in the West. There's no reference to Areopagitica in my story. But thanks to individuals like Milton, a book such as mine is able to see publication. Next to the book stands a bottle of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar, the bottomless bottle of beer that plays a major role in the story as the sad instrument of all our woe. I realize that's oblique, but you'll soon understand. Beside the bottle sits a grim reminder of our greatest woe, our mortality. It's literally a memento mori, the skull beneath the skin, and topped off with a burning candle to remind us that our time is short. And not only our time. The quote upon this low shelf states, "For he knoweth his time is short." That comes from Revelation 12:12 and refers to Satan, who has been unleashed upon the world, but just for a short time, which only serves to exacerbate his malice and thereby provides a motive to his practice of driving hard bargains, such as the Faustian ones that we often read about in Western literature. Neither the skull nor the quote from Revelation appear in my story, but Lindall has nonetheless provided a fitting interpretation of my tale. As for the rats, they do appear in the story as a case of mistaken identity, though I didn't quite imagine the top rat to look like Hitler. If you look carefully, it does look like Hitler. Finally, I call attention to the quote from Dostoevsky's famous book, The Brothers Karamazov. "I am Satan, and nothing human is alien to me." Quite a fitting quote for a story of this sort. Dostoevsky is, in fact, one of my favorite writers, and I read all of his books many years ago, so as a tribute to him, I've titled each of my books 8 chapters after a different book of his, and found a devilish quote from each of those books to follow each chapter title. The first chapter is titled Notes from Underground, followed by a relevant quote, "The devil only knows what desire depends upon." In this illustration, we see the naive protagonist, let's call him the naive, walking along the cobblestone street toward the shop wherein he will meet his doom. That's described in the story. But the woman holding the shoggoths, a seductress in this Faustian tale, does not appear in the story's first scene. Lindall has placed her here at the opening of the story as foreshadowing. That's his interpretation, but it fits. And now, without further ado, the story begins. The world sometimes just declines to cooperate with my good intentions. I had been drinking a bit more than my wife thought reasonable for my health and our pocketbook, and after a close encounter with a breathalyzer that I managed to confound by sheer dint of will, I bowed to her legalistic position on laws against drunk driving, and even agreed to stop drinking altogether. I didn't intend to pursue the 12-step route to complete spiritual indoctrination, so I resolved to quit entirely on my own. But I reasoned that such a significant occasion called for a drink. And I wanted that drink to be extraordinary, even unforgettable. My wife grudgingly acceded to my desire for just one more bottle to celebrate my decision, and I began to wander the town looking for that perfect beer. My quest took me down to an old part of the city that I had never seen before, and I was surprised at its narrow and twisting cobblestone streets. The area looked vaguely European, too archaic for the New World, but I shrugged the impression off, figuring the streets and buildings had been designed to draw tourists. Such traps are never what they seem to the unwary, but I had to marvel that the effect was so authentic. I noticed a few wine shops, and their selections were truly excellent, again an authentic touch, though the shops seemed to stock only older vintages. But I wasn't looking for wine anyway. At length, on a back street that twisted like a wandering maze, only to decline into a dead end, I came upon a shop, above whose door was a metal arrow extending sharp point outward, perpendicular to the shop's facade, and from whose shaft, suspended by 2 hooks, was a small sign bearing some rather puzzling words in Gothic script that I managed to make out after a fair bit of close inspection. Our Back's Ratskeller, Mr. Falland M., proprietor. I could at first only imagine an exterminator of rats, but the word was not Ratskiller, definitely Ratskeller. Was it a misspelling? Curious, I attempted to peer through the window. But the shop was dark, and I could make out nothing of the vague room's shape, nor of anyone within, nothing distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, just seemingly insubstantial shadow. Overwhelmed with curiosity, I tried the door and found it unlocked. So I entered. The room was indeed dark, and there seemed no electrical lighting, nor any switch near the door, though I fumbled for one. Gradually, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, allowing a weak light filtering in through the front window to provide sufficient illumination. I still saw no one present. "Mr. M?" I called out, though weakly, unsure I should be in the shop. I waited a moment and was ready to turn and leave when I heard a creaking to the left. I looked in that direction, and in the midst of dim obscurity glimpsed a tall form entering the room through a door that had been pushed open. Or I thought the form tall. As it limped toward me, it seemed to diminish in height. A man? I wondered. As I looked more closely, the form appeared no longer to limp. I accounted my errors in vision to a trick of the poor lighting. "Mr. M?" I asked the form. "Yes," came the reply in a smooth, rich baritone, a lovely voice with a wisp of smoke in its timbre. "I'm Mr. M. How might I help you?" He had by now crossed the room more quickly than expected, and I seemed to catch the slight hint of a foreign accent. "Well," I hesitated, "I really don't want to trouble you." I looked him over, trying not to stare. But the person was somehow compelling. He had very dark eyes, though the room was not well lit enough to judge clearly, but I hazard to say that the iris of each eye was fully as dark as its pupil, like deep wells into which one might stumble. His hair was dark too, jet black. In contrast, his skin was light, though not fair. One might find him handsome. I thought some woman might, some Eve or other, find him seductive. He looked to be in his 40s, and he waited patiently, perhaps accustomed to being looked at. "I don't really wish to trouble you," I repeated. "Oh, it's no trouble at all," he assured, putting me entirely at ease. "I was wondering about the name," I said. "The name?" He sounded puzzled. "Yes, this shop's name." "Ah, I see. You mean Auerbach's Ratskeller." "Yes. Well, it should more correctly say Auerbach Ratskeller, but the ones who made the sign weren't proficient in English. Auerbach refers to this shop's location here at the back end of the street." "I was particularly curious about Ratskeller," I admitted. Mr. M smiled sympathetically. "Ah, that. My apologies. I should have understood. The word is German. Keller is the same word as cellar, and Rat is short for Rathaus, or City Hall. It refers to the basement of a city hall. Beer was traditionally served in such places." "Beer?" I echoed, surprised. "Oh yes, beer," he affirmed. "It's conducive to discussion. Think of how much advice bartenders offer when talking to drinkers. There's even an English philosopher who has scrutinized the culture of alcohol and claims that virtuous drinking has contributed to the Western tradition of democratic rule because it loosens the tongue without loss of reason." I stared at the one standing before me. Who was this individual? I wondered. Was he from England? He had mentioned some English fellow, but I hadn't caught an English accent. Yet there was definitely some obscure hint of an accent, though he spoke with fluency. I glanced about the room, seeking some national clue, a flag, a map, a foreign book, but nothing. At that moment, I saw the cat. It was an enormous black tomcat, heavy, nearly as large as a hog, sprawled out in an armchair and apparently napping. The fellow noted where I was looking. "Oh, don't mind Behemoth," he assured. "My friend is harmless, for the most part." I stared at the oddly named, grotesquely large cat and vaguely remembered from some history book, from some history course, a book of that title about Nazi Germany. I looked again at the stranger beside me and recalled the detailed Ratskeller explanation. "Are you German?" I asked. No, he replied, then fell to thinking and reconsidered. "Yes, perhaps I am German." Bewildered, I sought familiar ground. "You mentioned beer." "Yes, I did." He smiled again, an encouraging smile. "Why?" "I'm looking for a fine beer. I need the best. Do you deal in beer? I mean, this being a Ratskeller?" "Certainly. Precisely what we deal in. We have an excellent stock of truly magnificent beers. What, might I ask, is the occasion?" "I'm a little embarrassed to say," I admitted, "but I plan on drinking just one more bottle of beer and then swearing off alcohol." "Ah," he remarked, his voice full of proper sympathy. "I see." He considered the complicated situation for a few long moments, as though scanning with his mind's eye an endless list of potential beers. Finally, he focused again on me. "I believe we have just the one for you, something we call Shoggoth's Old Peculiar," in the triple B selection, naturally. Triple B? Oh, goodness, but I'm not being clear, am I? The triple B is our bottomless bottle of beer. I stared at the stranger. What was he talking about? What in hell was a bottomless bottle of beer? Was the odd fellow joking? How could a bottle without a bottom ever hold beer? He seemed to understand my visible perplexity. "Come," he beckoned. "We have several below, down in the cellar." He turned toward the door to the left, and I followed into a narrow hallway lit by candlelight. As we passed through the doorway, he said, "Behemoth, close the door behind us, please." I looked back, and from the dim yellow light,